This is the laboratory interpretation guide for the Women's Biologic Clock Ovarian Profile from Destiny Well. This chart shows the relationship between FSH and LH on the top and estrogen and progesterone responses on the bottom. FSH and LH are the pituitary hormones that regulate the secretion by the ovaries of estrogen and progesterone. FSH and LH both peak at mid-cycle, but LH has a higher surge, which is what stimulates ovulation. The first half of the phase is called the follicular part of the cycle. FSH is typically higher, and that leads to higher estrogen levels. Higher estrogen levels fall at mid-cycle, and that can lead to things like mid-cycle spotting and migraine headaches, because migraines come on whenever estrogen levels fall. They're maximum at times like the menstrual cycle, where the estrogen level is lowest. Progesterone is sustained and produced by the corpus luteum during the second half of the cycle. That's called the luteal phase. The second half of the cycle is more variable, whereas the first half, the follicular cycle, is a pretty standard 14 days. The second half of the cycle can vary from as short as 7 days to as long as 21 or more days. When we see a group of people in a population, it's hard to know which ones are actually healthy and which ones just look fine walking around. That's why we like to look at the overall profiles of people who are ideally healthy to set our optimals, rather than just the population at large, many of whom have incipient disease, things that haven't really been diagnosed yet, or may even be in advanced stages of different illnesses. At Destiny Well, we define laboratory ranges in a sophisticated way. We use the standard ranges, represented by the blue bar here, from each reference lab that does a particular test to define the lab high and the lab low. If you have thyroid test results that are too low based on the lab's formal norm, then you have a diagnosis of lab low thyroid function or hypothyroidism. Similarly, for glucose, if you have a lab high blood sugar of over 126 on 2 occasions, then you meet the formal diagnosis criteria for diabetes. That's needed to make a medical diagnosis. But at Destiny Well, we think that there can be a lot more nuance. We believe that there's often an optimal range based on what we have found going forward helps people to live the healthiest lives, to be the healthiest, and to avoid disease. We triangulate this with the medical literature, with other people's standards, with our clinical practice experience, and all the different data points we can get, so we can come up with what we believe is optimal for a particular test result. Destiny Well also, in the red bars here, will define a Destiny Well high and a Destiny Well low. These may or may not line up exactly with a laboratory high or low, because sometimes we think that the range can be higher or lower, or that it needs to be different. And in between the optimal and the green bar, and the low and the high in the red bars, we have orange zones for moderately high and moderately low. They're not quite optimal, but they're not in the high or low zone. We've already talked about our standard graph in terms of the standard range in blue, and then how Destiny Well likes to set an optimal range where we think that your best target is. Above that and below that are moderately high and moderately low, and then there's a Destiny Well high and a Destiny Well low that may or may not correspond with the standard range. That's what it is a lot of the time, but sometimes it's actually a different circumstance. So on the second set of graphs, the middle one showing optimal that butts up against the low. So it may be that you want to be in the bottom 50 or 60% of this, and you can't really be too low. So there are markers of inflammation and other kinds of problem things that less is better. So we might have a moderately high and a high in this circumstance, but we might not have a moderately low or a low. The same thing happens with the high end. So some things more is better. There are a number of hormones that it's better to be in the upper half of the range, or the upper 60%. In this case, optimal butts up against the high. There is still a moderately low and a low defined. And then the last circumstance, the bottom row on the slide, is where optimal has a lot of variables. So it may be that you could be on the high end of this if some other factor is low and still be perfect, and you could be on the low end of this and of optimal and still be perfect if other factors adjust for this. So it may be that there's not enough data to segregate that out, or it may be that it depends on enough other factors that setting an optimal range and a moderately high and a moderately low is not possible. So we can tell you what's too high and what's too low, and everything in the middle is an optimal. So those are the different kinds of outcomes we can get when we set optimal ranges. We wanted to go through that with you so that you can see what you're looking for, how we define optimal, and the ranges around it. FSH is the main pituitary hormone that regulates estrogen and is also predominant during the first half or follicular part of the menstrual cycle, when the follicle is getting the egg ready to ovulate. When measured on day 3 of the cycle, FSH can give an indication of how much ovarian reserve there is. As the FSH gets higher during this time, it means that the pituitary is having to try to stimulate the ovaries harder, that there are less functional ovarian follicles, and over time, less chance of pregnancy. Typically, the laboratory reference range during the follicular phase on day 3 is 2.4 units per liter on the low side and greater than 9.3 units per liter on the high side. When it gets to be lab high, the chances of getting pregnant go down, and especially as it gets over 12 or so, even with artificial implantation of a fertilized egg, then the chances are lower, but not zero. At Destiny Well, we've set the optimal range for day 3 follicular FSH measurements at 3 to 8. Values that are moderately low are 2.4 to 2.9 and are definitely low, less than 2.4. We want it to be 3 to 8 because that indicates that there are functioning follicles, but that the brain doesn't have to stimulate them too hard. Mildly elevated is 8.0 to 9.3, and definitely elevated is above 9.3. During the luteal phase, we see a slightly different range for FSH. FSH on the low side of the laboratory normal range is 0.6 units per liter, and on the high side is greater than 8.0. We still set the Destiny Well ideal range at 3 to 8, the moderately low range at 0.6 to 3, and a definitely low range at 0.6, with high being greater than 8.0 during this part of the cycle. FSH could be an indicator that a woman is in menopause or going into menopause. In general, after menopause, the FSH level goes up above 30. Values less than 30 are not generally consistent with menopause. The reference range is 31 to 134 units per liter for FSH. Values above 134 are generally not seen very often and may indicate problems. An FSH value above 30 on several indications is an indicator of menopause. The levels can go up and down during perimenopause, so a single reading is not a reliable indicator that a woman is in menopause. FSH has a number of key functions. In addition to regulating estrogen, especially during the follicular or first half of the menstrual cycle, and getting the egg ready to ovulate, it also has other functions. It serves as a marker for how much ovarian reserve there is. If FSH is higher, either during the 3rd day of the cycle in a premenopausal woman when we're thinking about fertility, or when it's higher all the time in a postmenopausal woman, it means that the pituitary is stimulating more FSH in order to try to drive the ovaries. The ovaries have less reserve, and so a higher FSH means that they have trouble responding, that the woman is closer to having infertility problems, or closer to or in menopause if it's significantly higher. Lower numbers of viable follicles that can produce eggs mean that the body has higher FSH levels to try to stimulate those follicles to produce. FSH itself also has another key function. It helps prevent apoptosis. That's the death of small follicles. So FSH helps to preserve the follicles until menopause so that there are more of them that could ovulate and have a baby. Follicles once recruited grow and produce estrogen hormones. So estrogen comes from stimulated follicles stimulated by the FSH. This graph shows that the FSH, like LH, peaks just before mid-cycle. The peak is not nearly as dramatic as with the LH, but it is notable. You can see that the FSH does tend to be higher during the early follicular phase and goes down during the second half of the cycle, during the luteal phase. At Destiny Well, we've been extremely fortunate to find some amazingly good coaches, people with backgrounds of success in varied fields who bring all sorts of resources and talent and skill to help you. These folks have many years of clinical experience, and they know how to be of assistance at every step of the way, from motivation to connecting you with the right resources to finding things that you need to get you on your journey. To learn more, go to destinywell.com/coaching to meet our team and find out how they can be of service to you.